Hi guys, welcome back. Today I want to talk you through the books that I managed to read during the month of March. I had a lot of fun challenging myself to read only books about Ireland or from Irish authors in participating in the Irish Readathon. And yeah, I had some really good reads this month, some okay reads as well, which still kept me entertained despite feeling slumpy because of all the stuff that's happening. So yeah, the first book I finished this month was Say Nothing, a true story of murder and memory in Northern Ireland by Patrick Radden McKeefe. This is a narrative non-fiction book that deals with the Troubles in Northern Ireland from about the 1960s to the 1990s, and it's kind of threaded around the story of an abduction of a mother at the height of the conflict in the 1970s, and through that it explores all the different aspects of this conflict and all the different parties that were involved, both official and like paramilitary and so on. I am just generally really interested in this, so this book was really interesting for me. I think you need to bring some kind of interest in the topic to really like it, but I really liked a lot of the themes that it was exploring at the same time as giving really in-depth information about the conflict itself. For example, it talks a lot about the consequences of that conflict and how that still influences Ireland today and other countries as well. And I really enjoyed the discussion that the author went into, talking about all these people that were actively involved in the conflict, how their radicalization happened, what pushed them to sometimes go to extremes and plant bombs and so on, but also how they dealt with the aftermath of all this, and talking a bit about are you a martyr or are you just a plain murderer? And is all that you've done really worth it in the end? I really appreciated the human and psychological angle that this book takes, and I think it's a really important topic to talk about when you talk about conflicts and wars, because it's just a really important part of kind of a whole country and a whole community coming to terms with something horrible that happened and trying to process it in a way. And at the same time, there's this very human and counterproductive reflex that people had and still have to also keep things secret and not talk about it, hence the title Say Nothing. So if you're interested in the Troubles at all, if you're interested in the history of Ireland, or if you're interested in general about memory of conflicts and aftermaths of conflicts and the psychological effect of them, I think you would really enjoy this book as well. Next up, I read a collection of short stories called Orange Horses by Maeve Kelly. It's 20 short stories that deal with different kinds of women in Irish society, mostly marginalized women. And the interesting thing is that the author, Maeve Kelly, was and is still very much engaged in battling for women's rights in Ireland, and also founded a shelter for women who are victims of abuse. So you could really see through her writing that she knows what she's talking about when she's telling the stories of some of these women. The stories are about women living in very rural areas and in farming communities, women who had to go through kind of horrible things like abuse or forced pregnancies. There was also a really good short story set in the Romani community in Ireland, as well as some that deal with Irishness and Englishness and how that clashes, which related back quite nicely to Say Nothing, which I read just before. I really enjoyed this. The language is very striking and to the point and really raw, but I think it was really effective for that. It kind of gave you this sense of realism and somehow also makes it show that these are potentially true stories, and these are things that are happening, and that's why I thought it was really well done. There were a few stories that somehow I absolutely didn't connect with, which kind of surprised me, but I think most of the other stories were very striking and I thought dealt with topics that were really important, and it just sometimes gave some really interesting slices of life into different kinds of women and different kinds of aspects of Irish society in general. So I really, really enjoyed this. I recommend you pick it up if it sounds at all interesting to you. Next up, I read a little novella by one of my favorite Irish authors, Colm Tóibín. That's the Testament of Mary, and as you can see, it's a really short book, and it is about elderly Mary, the mother of Jesus, if it wasn't clear until then. And she was forced to flee to Ephesus in Greece after the whole business with her son and after his execution. And she is surrounded by followers of his son that want to talk to her about him, and she just doesn't want to. And ultimately, the whole novella is a story about grief and about the mother who lost her son, but also a mother who kind of has to deal with guilt of her own because of her son going into a direction that she had this very bad feeling that it would not turn out well, and not having done anything about it early enough. So I really enjoyed this angle. It also puts into scene some parts of Jesus's life as you can read it in the Bible, for example, the resurrection of Lazarus or the wedding in Cana. But I don't think you have to be religious or anything to be compelled by this story, because it gives you this certain angle of the mother who is looking at her son and seeing all these events that unfold in a completely uncontrolled way, and that leads to a horrible death of the person she loves the most in the whole world. And as you know, I expected from Tóibín, the language is beautiful, it's very poetic, it is very evocative, and he is really just good at delving into people's feelings. And he does that also really well with women. And he does that really well with Mary, but he also did that really well in some other books like Nora Webster and Brooklyn. And I wasn't disappointed on that front, definitely. I did feel like this book was a bit short for all the stuff he wanted to address, and I would have liked him to go even further into his thesis of what would be happening in Mary's head through all these stories that I knew from the Bible. And some things just were really rushed, felt rushed at least for me. So that was just kind of a little minus point. But other than that, I'm glad I read this. I mean, I ultimately want to read pretty much everything he's written, so that was really good that I got to this one this month as well. Next up, I read another collection of short stories, and it was Dubliners by James Joyce. This was a weird experience. Going into it, I was hesitant whether I would like it, because obviously there's all these preconceptions about his bigger and more experimental books like Ulysses, and I knew that he plays around with stream of consciousness writing, and that's usually not really my jam, so I was a bit hesitant, but it's not like that in this book. So if you're put off by this, you can definitely give this one a go. And I actually really enjoyed his writing. What he does really well in these stories that all are set in Dublin and put into scene normal people going about their business in their lives from different places in Irish society, he is very good at giving a sense of place and of time. You could really feel like you were there at the beginning of the 1900s. And I personally really enjoy these kind of stories of everyday life, of normal people. And he does that really well with this little tone of sadness. And there's kind of a lot of these stories have a haunting quality, and at the same time I think it's also a lot about redemption. So these were all aspects I really enjoyed. The thing is though, about half of these stories kind of left me cold, and the other half was really amazing. So it's definitely a weird collection, and it was even weirder because it was really pretty much the first half of the stories that I didn't like, and suddenly I started liking the other stories. So I'm glad I pushed through, definitely. And my favorite short story of all of them is the last one. It's called The Dead, and it's about this New Year's Eve party where a lot of actors and dancers and people from the theater and the opera meet. And one of the women there hears one of the musicians perform this song, and it suddenly evokes some really strong feelings for her. And then, I'm not going to go into more detail, but this was such a beautiful story. And the collection really finished with a bang for me through this story. But still, I didn't enjoy all of this. I think ultimately it's just the collection that was really uneven for me, but it definitely had some real sparks of masterfulness. Finally, I read Agatha Christie's Secret Notes books by John Curran. This was really interesting to me personally. I thought it gave me a very fresh look into Agatha Christie as an author and learning more about her writing process. So John Curran is kind of an archivist, and he got access to Agatha Christie's notebooks that she had around her place all the time while she was writing, and he started cataloging them and analyzing them and filtering out some information and trying to understand what her writing process was like. In this book, he analyzes how she constructed her mystery plots, how she sometimes wrote down some idea like, I would like to write a story where the murderer does this, and then seeing this idea being realized, like, I don't know how many years later. She also swapped around ideas and took one plot element and ended up putting it into a whole completely different story. And it was just really interesting to kind of get in her head as an author. The thing is though, with this book, I think you have to be quite familiar with her work, in the sense of like having read most of her work at some point, or at least having watched a lot of adaptations, for example, and being familiar with a lot of her stories, because he links all these stories a lot together in terms of similar plot devices or construction or themes. And I think you can profit from reading this a lot more if you can see these connections, and therefore you kind of have to know something about the stories to begin with. There are indications at the beginning of each chapter about the stories that will be spoilered, so you can still go in and read through it and see if there's one that you don't know there, but a lot of the really famous ones are there. So I think it's really not for everyone, and if you still want to read it, you have to be kind of ready for big spoilers. But for me, it was really good as a big fan of hers and having read a lot of her work. And I think this book is a really interesting book for Agatha Christie nerds. Alright guys, these were the books I got through during the month of March. I had a lot of fun reading only books by Irish authors or about Ireland, and yeah, it's funny because the Irish Readathon is really pretty much the only readathon that I can see myself doing every year, and that's almost the only one I did last year because I'm just generally not really good at readathons. I don't like to put too many restrictions on myself, and I think just choosing to commit to only read about Ireland is enough restriction, and it's just enough for me, and it was a lot of fun. So yeah, let me know if you did participate and if you already wrapped up your reading for that, because I would love to see what you read and get some new recommendations, hopefully. And I hope you're doing well and that you're reading great books, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!